Today, we're going to Georgia in the 1790s. What unfolds there is one of the most infamous scandals of the early American Republic, involving bribery, outraged citizens, and a constitutional showdown. The Yazoo Land Fraud exposed deep tensions between state power, federal authority, and Native American sovereignty. And it ultimately led to Fletcher v. Peck in 1810. I'm your host, Crispin Catino, and this is the Yazoo Land Fraud. To understand the Yazoo scandal, we need to picture the political chaos of the early 1790s. The United States was young, and the state governments often operated with little oversight. Historian Jane Ellesmere notes that officials operated in an era where the line between legal and legitimate was blurred. The Yazoo territory was tens of millions of acres in present-day Alabama and Mississippi. And it was claimed by Spain, England, Georgia, and multiple Native American nations. Ellesmere calls these competing claims highly complex. But one point that really wasn't a point of contention is that Native peoples had the longest standing claim. Yet Georgia ignored this entirely. Historian Brendan Kennedy writes that leaders knew that any settlement would encroach on Native American territory, and that the sale itself amounted to, and I quote, an assault on Native American sovereignty. But to Georgia speculators, the West wasn't a diplomatic problem, it was a financial opportunity too tempting to resist. So, in January 1795, Georgia passed the Yazoo Act under Governor George Matthews, authorizing the sale of 35 million acres of western land to 4 land companies for the price of $500,000. Now, $500,000, even back then, was a price so low that it immediately raised suspicion. Jane Ellesmere's research reveals why. She writes that almost every member of the Georgia legislature received shares in the land companies. Payments that were land speculation bribes in all but name. They were paid off. These shares were distributed strategically to secure the votes needed to pass the act. Now, when the public learned about the details, the response was immediate and explosive. Newspapers condemned the corruption, and mass outrage swept the entire state. The public anger also spilled into symbolic action. A later illustration preserved by the Georgia Historical Society shows leaders such as James Jackson and John Millage burning a copy of the Yazoo Act. The public outrage of 1795 swept the old lawmakers out of office, and the new legislature moved quickly. In 1796, they passed what became known as the Rescinding Act, formally wiping away the Yazoo sale. But eliminating the act on paper didn't resolve the crisis. As Ellesmere explains, before the scandal broke, the land companies had already sold large portions of the Yazoo lands to buyers across the country. Many of these buyers were far removed from the original corruption. They had simply purchased what looked like legitimate titles to the lands of the Yazoo. These new owners now faced a nightmare. Georgia insisted the sale was void. Purchasers insisted they had paid for valid property. And as Ellesmere notes, the controversy triggered a fight involving the Yazoo claimants, who argued that their titles had to be honored despite the scandal. The Yazoo controversy ultimately landed before the U.S. Supreme Court in Fletcher v. Peck. As Jane Ellesmere puts it, the case would profoundly shape American constitutional law, and Chief Justice John Marshall approached it knowing the stakes stretched far beyond Georgia. Marshall did not dispute that the original Yazoo sale was rotten. He acknowledged, in fact, that, hey, there were impure motives. that had influenced the members of the legislature when they approved the sale. But he insisted that Georgia's own constitution, the legislature in 1795, still had the power of disposing of the unappropriated lands within its own limits. Then came the pivotal issue, whether Georgia could retroactively void the sale through its 1796 Rescinding Act. Marshall's answer was unequivocal. A grant, he wrote, is a form of contract executed, and when absolute rights have vested under that contract, a repeal of the law cannot divest those rights. To strike down the titles of later innocent purchasers would allow a state to seize property by its own act, a power Marshall warned was incompatible with constitutional government. That led him to the heart of the matter. Georgia's Rescinding Act was a law impairing the obligations of contracts and therefore was unconstitutional. It was a landmark moment. The first time the Supreme Court invalidated a state law under the U.S. Constitution. This ruling, of course, enraged many Georgians. Ellesmere notes that states' rights advocates accused the court of meddling in internal affairs of their state, insisting Chief Justice John Marshall had overstepped. Yet Ellesmere also emphasizes Marshall's strategic foresight. By ruling that Georgia could not undo the sale, while also refusing to declare the private titles valid, he forced Congress to resolve the dispute. Because so much investment capital was tied up in the disputed titles, Congress ultimately compensated the claimants, solidifying the principle that federal authority, not state politics, would govern the resolution. Marshall understood exactly what he was doing. The Yazoo case allowed him to articulate a sweeping vision of federal constitutional power, using a corrupt land deal to cement the supremacy of the contract clause and the authority of the Supreme Court itself. Marshall's decision settled the legal dispute, but it did not resolve the deeper forces driving the Yazoo scandal. Modern historians remind us that the fraud was not just a constitutional crisis. It was part of a broader era of aggressive expansionism. Alan Taylor argues that after the Revolution, Americans felt to expand or die, pushing into Western territories with new confidence and little restraint. The Yazoo lands fit squarely within that mindset. Stuart Banner places this moment in an even wider pattern. He shows that native land loss occurred through shifting legal norms and strategic manipulation of property law, not just open conflict, so not just wars. Land became a commodity, and law became a tool to dispossess native nations. Why fight the natives when you can dispossess them through legal action? The Yazoo Land Fraud reminds us that the early United States was shaped as much by corruption, ambition, and contested land claims as by constitutional ideals. And in Fletcher v. Peck, we see how the court chose legal stability over accountability. I hope you've enjoyed today's deep dive into one of America's earliest political scandals. I'm Crispin Catino, and I'll see you next time.